This is Yesterzine, an ocean of calm in a sea of panic. Unless they make me play Rise of the Robots again. We play the highest and lowest rated games from an old video game magazine to see if class is eternal, while looking for what it tells us about gaming, when website was just where a spider builds his home. Our magazine today is one that's still running as of early 2020, multi-format title Edge, now the only mainstream multi-format magazine still published. But here, still, the exotic, wordy, mature magazine focused on the future of video games. It launched at a good time, on the nexus of the 16 and 32-bit eras, and as multimedia hovered on the horizon. That was certainly true with our issue today, issue 5 from February 1994. Our gaming heaven and hell both take advantage of CD formats to do things you couldn't have done 2 years earlier. But with that long since not a unique selling point, how do they look today? Our cover feature is the same as Edge's, the phenomenon of, probably for the first time, companies spending millions marketing their games. These days you pretty much just get the trailer in 30-second form, but back then they were getting creative. Ooh heck, is that the time? We really must be going out. It's time to hit the road.
Next.
To be this good takes Satan.
Licensed video games are a minefield. It was a running joke in the golden age that there wasn't much of a property Ocean couldn't turn into a side-scrolling platformer. And in general, Ocean's games were on the higher end of the quality spectrum, especially if you played them on a higher end spectrum. LucasArts, known previously as Lucasfilm Games, knew this more than most. They were of course the home of Star Wars and Indiana Jones games almost by default. With titles like X-Wing and Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, they took licenses and turned them into some of the all-time classic games. And so it appeared to be 1 year after that Indiana Jones title. Sam & Max Hit the Road was licensed from a comic book created by Steve Purcell in 1987. This was something of a freebie for LucasArts, since Steve was also employed there as an artist and animator. You've seen his work right back in episode 1 of this show on Monkey Island 2. And he also did the character designs for the exceptionally weird Mega Drive game, Toe Jam and Earl, which you'll find on the Mega Drive Mini. So perhaps it's not a surprise that Sam & Max became an adventure game at LucasArts. The anarchic manic combination of a 50s gumshoe private eye style dog, Sam, and wisecracking, fearless, actively insane rabbit Max lends itself absolutely to LucasArts' trademark humour.
Volatile hostage situation, Max. Ooh, does this mean we get to kick some puffy white mad scientist butt? Can't think of a reason not to.
We're fully entering the CD era here. Sam & Max wasn't the first LucasArts game to use the format. It was beaten by Maniac Mansion sequel Day of the Tentacle by a few months, and that Indiana Jones game. And Sam & Max does still have a floppy disk version. It was, though, the first to be designed fully with CDs in mind, featuring the first implementation of the next generation of the SCUM engine that powered all Lucas adventure games. What this means is, finally, selecting verbs is gone, replaced with a simplified set of icons you can iterate through for walk, talk, pick up and use. It's easy to understand and crucially means that, unlike the older games, the artwork and game space can be full screen, allowing for a lot more detail, especially as the resolution has increased since the Monkey Island games, with systems like the Amiga being discarded for a PC and Mac only release. It also helped the comedy. Steve always hated the choose your response mechanic of previous games, as nothing would kill a joke worse than reading it before you hear it. So Sam & Max uses icons representing the general conversation topic instead. I grant you I've somewhat ruined that by turning on the subtitles for my captures to help you guys out. The first thing you notice about Sam & Max is that a combination of increased resolution, storage, its comic book roots, and dumping the lower powered machines for ones with increased animation capability all combine to give it a very unique and fluid visual style. This is apparent very early on, when the phone rings in the office and a fight between Sam and Max to answer ends with Sam catapulting Max out the open window.
Hello?
It's a great comic moment, and one that wouldn't have been possible with older tech. It's quickly followed up with another moment where a man gets thrown out of an office, hooking himself on the banister.
Piece of this! Brutal. But very true to life. And here's one for your old man. I really respect Flint's business acumen.
Please, Sam, don't use the word acumen again.
We hit the street, and the bonded city courier delivering our orders quickly turns out to be disguised as a cat, who has unfortunately swallowed the information. This introduces the remaining interaction method, as Sam can use Max on someone, in this case to do an order-ectomy. The case turns out to take place at the local carnival. Their star attraction, an iced Bigfoot, who, despite all appearances is not your mum, has escaped. And worse, he's taken Trixie, the giraffe-necked lady, with him. After a quick stop-off to ride the tilt-a-whirl, we get a tip that someone in the Tunnel of Love may know something. Sam and Max had an advantage of already well-formed characters, and it shows. The game is loosely based on one of the comic book issues as well, but it wouldn't work without having the animation tech to pull off the physical nature of the characters and comedy. I don't think LucasArts could have made this game before they did. Even with that base though, some inspired casting, like most things in the game supervised by Steve himself, really helps move the thing along. As with the animation tech, I think this game came along at the right time for audio too. It's the first time I really feel you'd have trouble pulling this off in terms of humour if you'd had to communicate it entirely in text. It's certainly a game where, if you're playing yourself, you should try to do so without those subtitles if you can. More than any other game, the comedy is distinctly improved by the timing. The whole of Sam & Max is inventive, varied and delightful. The plot somehow just about makes sense, and the ending, which of course I won't talk about, is pretty satisfying at tying up the loose ends. You should 100% play this one. Unlike some LucasArts games from around this period, it's not got a remaster or a re-release other than a Windows compatibility patch in 2002. But it doesn't need it. If you buy it, like we did from GOG.com, you'll get a version packaged seamlessly inside the open source wrapper ScumVM, and it worked perfectly first time on our Windows 10 setup. If you've got the tech chops, then you could take your files and put them in ScumVM yourself, which means you could run it on Linux, Mac, even a modern Amiga if you like. You could also run it on sufficiently modified Nintendo Switches and 3DSs, a PlayStation 3, or even a Dreamcast. There's no excuse. While there wasn't a proper remake, there were, ultimately, sequels. LucasArts never made one, despite at one point announcing it. But as with Monkey Island, Telltale Games picked up the baton. Between 2006 and 2010, they released 3 seasons totaling 16 smaller episode-sized games, under the names Sam & Max Save the World, Beyond Time and Space, and The Devil's Playhouse. The team consisted of several of the original Sam & Max team, including Steve Purcell. Steve, though, said his input was minimal for the best of reasons. The team knew what they were doing. By this point he was busy anyway. For the last 20 years he's been working for Pixar, where he was heavily involved in the Cars films and video games, and was co-director and co-writer of the film Brave. You've heard him, probably without knowing it. He's the voice of the creepy Benson dummies in Toy Story 4. These days there's a lot of video game marketing. It's a big industry, but the actual adverts are pretty standard. They just throw up a 30-second version of their teaser trailer and stick on a logo for whomever helped them pay for the ad, usually a bumper for Microsoft or Sony. Take this random example.
Need for Speed Most Wanted, rated everyone 10 and up.
Video games marketing in the Golden Age was weird. It was subversive. It was just graduating from the period where all they had were magazine ads in the specialist press and into big budget TV ads. As we get to this issue of Edge, their figures were that Sony and Nintendo were each spending something like £1 million a week in the holiday season. The general budget for video games advertising had gone up by 12 times in the 3 years since 1991. This is money they could spend, of course, because the retail market of the industry had grown 30 times in that time. It's a tempting rewrite of history to mark the PlayStation 1 as when gaming went mainstream. But at this point that's 18 months away in the UK, and the trend is very much on the march. Edge correctly, but probably mostly unknowingly, spots a trend that's the lament of this very show. That the barriers between brands crumbled in terms of a unique offering. Not to the extent that today you need a digital foundry video to work out the difference between versions, of course. But as they point out, Christmas 1993, both Nintendo and Sega had Aladdin and Street Fighter II as their big games. They describe it as the difference between Coke and Pepsi, a no man's land where the marketers go over the top to fight for the hearts, minds and wallets of the game's playing public. And as such, the combination of this being a new medium, there being confusion of exactly which segment they were targeting, and video trailers for games just not really being a thing yet, meant that ads were imaginative.
Leaner than it's movie time! Wine! This place is a pigsty! Wait! But you to prove our superiority! Choose your weapon!
What a bore. This is the Mega Drive 2, one of the most powerful 16-bit machines ever made. Go on, pig. Make my day.
Here, stop hogging it. This is the end! And this is the other end! Mega CD! So, try Swedish bacon! Try Mega Drive! That's a real pig!
That advert absolutely communicates Sega's approach, defining themselves as rebellious, anti-establishment, and for want of a better word, cool, in a way Nintendo weren't, really. Sega's marketing director Simon Morris put it thusly.
The brand is about innovation. Here's the new generation of interactive entertainment. We have to be different. We can't do something tacky or old-fashioned.
And at the risk of making a cheap shot, look at these two men. I think it's fairly obvious immediately which one is Simon and which one is Mike Hayes, who did the same job at Nintendo. In this era, Sega were outselling Nintendo in the UK, and that marketing is a big reason why. To his credit, Mike admits this.
We'd always been leading by a long way, and then Sega started their new style, and with the launch of the Mega Drive, they managed to overtake us on the market share for a period of the second half of '92 to the first 6 months of this year.
Which is why Mike started looking for their own way to make Nintendo cool. Simply copying Sega wasn't going to work, so they needed something good, and it was an inspired, if perhaps surprising choice for Nintendo to turn, as we saw a couple of episodes ago, to Rick Mail.
My friends at Nintendo have placed 4 Super Mario games on the same cart for less than 50 of your pounds. Super Mario Bros. 1 is pretty tricky. Super Mario Bros. 2 is a little more advanced. Super Mario Bros. 3 is... But Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels is so difficult, it could actually unhinge the balance of your mind.
Aren't you that talentless celebrity women find repellent?
See what I mean? It's completely Tonto.
Mario All-Stars, infuriating innovative Nintendo.
Nintendo spent a total of £10 million on this, and given there are still Nintendo consoles and not Sega ones, you'd have to suggest it wasn't a complete failure. Sega and Nintendo as hardware manufacturers led this charge. Edge points out the software companies were well behind them. They saw an opportunity for people who got that right. And I don't think they were wrong too. We're right on the edge here of EA making their full EA Sports push, and creating a slogan that's probably more iconic than anything Nintendo came up with, and right up there with, "To be this good takes ages." The software company's main tools have been magazine reviews, and of course, preview coverage. Edge had some problems there. The first being the obvious one that you can't control reviews, although those who watched the Rise of the Robots special currently have their hands up. Edge are with you on that, recounting an anonymous tip that reviews could be bought for a very expensive lunch. They weren't given names, but we're certainly of the opinion that if Amiga Power fans are here, they're currently thinking, Michael Jackson. The other problem we touched on earlier, the major growth in the market meant the average consumer had changed. Edge kindly calls them early adopters and enthusiasts. Acclaim's marketing manager Paul McGarvey is less kind.
You have to take into account that a lot of people play games but aren't part of what might be called the anorak culture.
And to be fair, Acclaim were the company out and trying stuff. They're talking here at the tail end of the campaign for the home versions of Mortal Kombat, mostly converted by Probe, making their third appearance at this series. He had the advantage, of course, that MK was controversial. In a world just past the appearance of games like Night Trap, the fatalities of Mortal Kombat were both a selling point and a bloody rallying cry for those who believed games were evil. Boots, back then amazingly a viable source of new games, and Toys R Us had both refused to stock the thing at first. Nintendo, who had famously vowed Night Trap would never be on any of their systems, got cold feet too, and handed Sega a huge marketing advantage by banning blood and forcing Midway to change all the fatalities in the SNES version of the game. Acclaim's marketing played right into this, featuring a poster too cool to show anything of the game's packaging or indeed gameplay. It's a familiar trick now, but was very new then, as Paul explained.
It's making a statement that this is a powerful piece of popular culture. It's never been done before for games. They tend to be very straightforward. Here's the game, here's a couple of quotes from magazines, here's a couple of screenshots. Oh, and by the way, it's out now.
Acclaim spent £1 million on this poster campaign, about 10 times what most publishers were spending on equivalent games. They believed it to be the first game where the marketing costs were more than the development ones, which just tells you how cheap games were to make them. Acclaim justified this because of the sheer number of platforms, as many as 8, that the game was launching on at once. The lack of specific footage meaning that the ad was equally applicable to PC as it was to Master System, SNES, or even Game Boy. The other half was a deliberate strategy to court the controversy for marketing benefit. The game was slapped with music-style parental advisory stickers. A year before video game age ratings came in, they deliberately went to the Video Standards Council to get it approved as if it was a film. And being aggressive about the game being compared to real violence, claiming, correctly to be fair, that all that does is trivialise actual violence. Paul's parting shot is to point out that Acclaim sold about £20 million worth of Mortal Kombat off the back of this, despite the game being universally rated lower than Street Fighter II in the specialist press, including Edge. The question Edge poses is, assuming they didn't spend on marketing but instead spent that bringing prices down to increase sales that way, would that result in a better overall performance? Mike Hayes from Nintendo pointed out that since Nintendo brought their marketing in-house earlier that year, they'd halved the price of the Game Boy, and took 15% off the SNES, considering price to be a component of marketing. But that doesn't change marketing's basic function.
A fundamental of marketing is to let people know what it is we've got and what price it is. Some people might say 10 million is too much to pay to do this, but at the end of the day, we've got 8 million consumers out there. If you don't tell them what you're doing, you're kinda dumb.
And while those are big figures, it's 5% or so of revenue for the hardware companies, and it was about the same for Acclaim with Mortal Kombat. Paul had done his research, and it suggested you'd have to reduce the big boy game prices from £50 right down to under 30 to make a big sales difference. And given Nintendo were unlikely to change their cut of around 15 quid, that would cost much more than the £1 million on marketing did. In reality, the marketing was adding maybe £2 to the cost per copy. Too much marketing was bad as well, of course. Mike again.
The product is always bigger than your advertising. But this business is in danger of becoming over-marketed and over-precious about that marketing.
His target here was Sega's famous Mega CD campaign that was nearly 3 minutes long and cost a massive amount, to sales that were not what Sega was looking for. Mike did point out that marketing something poor will not result generally in the increased sales to the extent required to pay for the campaign, and came with the cost of damaging your long-term reputation. Sega's Simon Morris agreed on this one.
We advertised a piece of software I knew was not a good game. It was a serious underestimation of our consumers. I thought good advertising would make up for it. We just shifted a few more copies, and the consumers became a lot more cynical about our advertising. You can't kid kids. You may get away with it once, but they won't let you get away with it twice.
Simon never revealed the game, so we don't know what he's referring to. If I had to guess, the mess Sega made of converting Turbo Outrun the previous year seems an obvious candidate. Still, it's quite nice to know that, long term, marketing doesn't quite trump the need to actually make a good game.
Just a guide last touch with reality. You certainly had something.
There are no winners. Death is just another beginning.
His world looked a lot more interesting. Besides, who could blame him for going crazy?
He was still stuck on level 2! Okay, Megan.
Regular viewers will know the generational nexus of this time, with 3D, CD, and the new companies coming into gaming, is a particular obsession of this show. And the news pages of Edge 5 are a goldmine of what was, what would be, and what would never happen. Firstly, accompanied by a Paul Kidby artist impression that really isn't that far off the eventual machine considering it's still well over a year away, Edge go hype crazy on a forthcoming Sega console, then going under the codename Saturn, and later going under the real name Saturn. The contact describes it as more power than Sega's famous Virtua Racing arcade machine, which would then have set you back a 5-figure sum to obtain. On raw numbers they were not so far out on the tech specs, although very late on they put a second CPU in the machine. This contributed to the Saturn's ultimate Achilles heel. It was always a very difficult machine to program to anything like full performance. This is also why it's a complete cow to emulate, in a way that even the later Sega Dreamcast isn't. Finally, the expected 4 times speed CD-ROM in the article, which would have blown the others well out of the water, had mysteriously become a standard double-speed unit equal to the PlayStation's by the time of release. The other problem for the Saturn was it also came in at double the UK price mentioned in the Edge article, prompting the famous Sony press conference consisting entirely of Sony announcing undercutting them by $100.
$299.
Speaking of Sony, at this point in the development of the PlayStation they were still hedging their bets and were producing Saturn demos they intended to use to help them port their games between the machines. That relationship was about to become a lot more combative. The PlayStation is on the next page in fact, complete with a considerably less accurate rendering and still under its codename PlayStation X. This incidentally is why we still use PSX as the short form codename for the machine, despite Sony actually releasing a real machine called the PlayStation X the best part of a decade later. This time they're spot on with the specs, although the 3DGE chip would get a rename to something slightly less embarrassingly 80s by release. Tellingly though, even Edge stresses its ability to do 4,000 2D sprites. This is accurate, but fundamentally misses where gaming was going. Sega too had made this mistake. The Saturn had been designed as a sprite-scaling powerhouse of a machine, designed to nail arcade games of the pre-retro racing era, and the second CPU was a hurried addition to try and combat that. Sony always recognised 3D polygons were the future, and we ended up with machines that had very much distinct strengths on that basis. Edge stressed Sony is going after software, but has wildly differing success with their 2 examples of what that might be. The supposed Sony published Warlock I can find no mention of elsewhere on the internet, although Acclaim released a 16-bit game by that name a year later. The second though was mention of a big tie-up with Namco, which would result in 2 of the machine's standout launch games, Ridge Racer and Tekken. Also pictured is a screenshot from Sony's demo for the PlayStation, which would become Psygnosis' fairly legendary Formula 1 game for the platform. This month also saw the launch of the Atari Jaguar, which tried to skip a generation in the bit wars by claiming to be a 64-bit machine. Without getting bogged down in the details, while they were the best kind of correct, they were also dead wrong. The processor of the Jaguar was actually the same as the Amiga, or more pertinently the Atari ST computer, which was 16-bit, and its 2 graphics processors were 32-bit on a 64-bit architecture. This caused precisely the same is-a-cow-to-program issue that plagued the Saturn. The Jag software lineup at launch was also lacking major titles, with just 3 carts available, none of which were especially exciting. The Jag needs a proper look sometime, but ultimately, despite ambitious plans to launch a CD drive, which they did, and a VR headset, which commercially they very much did not, Atari were already in financial trouble after several missteps in the early 90s, and never had the money to market the thing in the way we've already talked about in this show. the Jag, and Atari would be gone inside a couple of years. The other console of the forthcoming generation was currently still known as Project Reality, but you now know it as the Nintendo 64. Details were still sketchy as of Edge 5, but 3DO president Trip Hawkins chose to take a swipe anyway. Among rumours, Nintendo had split with co-designer Silicon Graphics.
Nintendo have made their bed and now they'll have to lie on it. They have proven to be a great toy company, but they are way out of position to compete in the new multimedia market.
Which was unfortunate, because not only were those rumours entirely incorrect, but the last item in Edge's news section was specifically about how badly the 3DO launch had gone. It doesn't get better for Trip and 3DO either, because they're about to take a starring role in our gaming hell. I don't think we can have a season of Yesterzine without an interactive movie at this point. Last season we saw both digital pictures, the kings of the medium, and the authors of the aforementioned Night Trap, whose Ground Zero Texas was a surprisingly engaging gaming heaven. But we also saw rocket science games, whose Tesla Hyperloop-inspired Lodestar was less convincing, despite having Elon Musk as a programmer. There's a couple more famous names from the period. Cinematronics produced Laserdisc games, with the collaboration of legendary animator Don Bluth. You'll recognise Dragon's Lair, their most famous series. These, though, were essentially pure video branching with no overlays, and ran from Laserdisc. Even by the standards of these kinds of things, they're thin interactively. In 1983, though, they were stunningly beautiful in an arcade where their competition was the likes of the very first Mario Brothers game, released just 5 days before the first Dragon's Lair. The other main name, once we got to proper CD-based machines and could at least attempt interaction beyond branching videos, was American Laser Games, whose primary arcade franchise is our gaming hell, Mad Dog McCree. Mad Dog, unlike the digital pictures games, is an arcade port, so we're already saying goodbye to the feature-length story of games like Night Trap, or the much closer comparison piece of Ground Zero Texas. Mad Dog was a bit of a weird arcade machine, because it's based on, of all things, an Amiga 500, messed about with enough to be able to read video off a Laserdisc. Which is why it's slightly weird none of the Amiga-based machines got what must surely have been a basically free port of the thing. In the home, it got releases for PC, Sega CD, CDI, and, as I implied a minute back, our review subject this month, the 3DO. The first major flaw is the video quality. This is a 32-bit machine. It can do video CD quality video at least, and the game was originally shot for Laserdisc, meaning pretty decent quality footage is available. But instead we get this muddy mess, which somehow manages to be more difficult to see than the massively resolution-constrained software decoded video of Ground Zero on the Mega CD. Mad Dog doesn't help itself either, as you can see in this practice sequence where you shoot bottles that are practically invisible brown on a brown background. I missed shooting a bottle, which does not bode well for the main game. The reason for that, though, is the other fundamental flaw with this game. It's a light gun shooter on a system that never got a light gun. To be fair, this was essentially true of Ground Zero Texas too, but while that made sure the cursor moved quickly and they cleverly scripted the game to make it possible, Mad Dog's footage was already shot for an arcade game with guns, and so, especially late in the game, people come from everywhere. Which is why it's such a shame the cursor moves quite so glacially by default, and the hitboxes are so tight and fussy. It rapidly becomes essentially impossible on a 3DO. I continually got killed outside the sheriff's office despite knowing exactly where things were going to come from, because I couldn't physically get the cursor into exactly the right pixel. And inside the bank, I think it's impossible unless you already know the sequence, which is not a good look for an arcade game. You can speed the cursor up a little, but for some reason that's on another button when it should just be the default. Especially as you only get 3 lives and the lengthy and irritating intro is unskippable. It also has horribly glitchy sound, but only sometimes. I am trying this on an emulator, and you could blame it on that, but it doesn't explain why it's an intermittent problem. What certainly isn't an emulator problem is the loading delays. With the slow CD and the 3DO, people can fall over so long after you shoot them that you'd think they were a football player taking a dive or something. And the pausing and resuming of the game video really doesn't help the whole thing. I think this is a problem of port rather than game, really. In an arcade, with a gun, Mad Dog came with a huge cabinet with a big screen and guns. With better video quality, no pausing, and an ability to actually shoot things, it's probably well worth trying out. The 3DO version was a nightmare though, and its 3 out of 10 review came at a poor time for the system, which we already learnt last season was going down the drain. Especially as the only other offering this month is the average Stellar 7, while the news section was teasing beauties from Sega, Sony, and even Atari with Rebellion's ultimately iffy take on Checkered Flag. I don't want to seem down on the 3DO itself over the issues we've covered it in. It was a lovely and groundbreaking system without which we wouldn't have had the Need for Speed series, which debuted 3D FIFA, and in many ways set us up for a lot of what followed. But the initial games, Crash and Burn aside, were an incoherent, badly marketed mess, and if you're lucky enough to have one, this is not a game you want for it. If you see a Mad Dog machine hanging around an arcade somewhere though, go right ahead. On the back page, we find Pete and professional marketing manager impersonator Mike, who together form RetroSesh, the anarchic retro duo whose main outputs come down to games they aim to complete, or obsessions, and ones they haven't played before and probably never will again. If you weren't sold by that quality pun just then, perhaps consider watching them play favourite of this show, Die Hard Trilogy, or even Rise of the Robots, because someone has to. You'll find them lurking on Twitter as RetroSesh, on YouTube, and quite possibly in your dreams somewhere around 3 AM. And that's our show. Tune in for the Series 3 finale next week, won't you? If you want to be reminded, YouTube requires you to both subscribe and click the bell icon in what I think the kids are calling gamification. If you want to contact us, this episode was written around week 1 of a lockdown I can only assume is still going on in the future when you see this. Twitter, thus, is now where I live. And if you're still in your panic room, remember there's 2 previous seasons of this nonsense to revisit. Bye!